Good morning again, everyone. My name is Danny. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, I serve at Mosaic Church as one of the pastors over there. Specifically, I am the campus pastor at the Disney campus over there. I've been there for most of the last 12 years and specifically serving in Myra for the last 7. And I love King's Cross ever since Caesar began dreaming about church planting, just having conversations with him. It was just always exciting to me to hear what he was up to and where his heart and mind was and where he believed the Spirit was leading him. And so to be in this space is really holy ground. And not because a particular type of building is holy, but because where the people of God are gathering together to worship and to make much of Jesus. It's a really beautiful and sweet space. And there's even something sweet about this physical space here at Four Roots Farm. The fact that there are so many windows, I just love it. Every time I get to come here, I just love it. I hope you guys enjoy how cool of a space this is. It's more than just cool, though. It's more than just neat. It proclaims creation. It allows whatever the weather is outside to be visible at least. Hopefully, like if it's storming outside, you don't feel that. But you can see, you're not leaving what happens outside out there, pretending as if we're a closed off reality in here. And so I just love this space. Now, this series that we're going to be doing over the course of the next 4 weeks is called Practicing the Way. It is based on the book Practicing the Way and the ministry Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer and some others. And this is because when me and the next 3 speakers that are going to be here the next 3 weeks, we're chatting with Caesar. We asked Caesar, like, what are the needs of your church right now? Is there anything in particular that you would love for us to speak into? And what he said is, I would love for something that's like Practicing the Way. And we said, okay, great, we'll do Practicing the Way. And specifically being able to talk about discipleship at the level of spiritual disciplines and what are we doing in our everyday lives to abide deeply with Jesus. And that's what the book is all about. That's what their ministry is all about. What we're going to be teaching over the course of the 4 weeks are inspired by all of their resources, but it's not just copy and paste from that. So if you've read the book already, you don't feel like you have to tune out. There's going to be some different stuff that we'll talk through. But this week is all about what it means to be apprenticed to Jesus. Apprenticed to Jesus. Now, we modern humans, especially in the West, love to believe that we are so individualistic that we are somehow masters of our own destiny. At least I know I do, and I was raised in that line of thinking. We love stories in Hollywood that make much of this, right? We have Maverick in Top Gun Maverick. I mean, his call sign is literally Maverick. It couldn't get any more I'm an individual than the name Maverick. Or more recently in Devil Wears Prada 2, you have Andy. Like that is, her entire character is all about like, I'm going to get after it, I'm going to get it, I'm going to figure it out. But there was a 2008 study that was done, and it's been replicated many times, that showed just how influenced even us in the individualized West still are. It's a funny one. Think about last time you went to a hotel and you went into the bathroom and there was a little sign that was in the bathroom that said something about, maybe a sign like this. Replace towels. A towel hanging up means I'll use again. A towel on the floor means please replace. And then it usually will say something about like it's good for the environment. And the thing is that call, that moral call to care for the environment, it's not really listened to by many people at all. Instead, if you're there for multiple days, you're like, I'm getting a fresh towel every single day. And so they changed the wording on one of the signs, this research group, to say 75% of guests who stay in this hotel reuse their towels. And all of a sudden, the number went up by 26%. Just finding out that, people like me who stay in this hotel, they actually do reuse their towels. Okay, well, if I'm a person who stays here and other people like me stay here. But then they did a third level where they did additional ones where the sign instead said 75% of guests who stay in this room reuse their towels. And then the number skyrocketed even higher. What possible difference does it make what the other people who stay in this room do? But at the level of proximity, similarity, tribal identity, and perceived local norms, we begin to change. If we know that people who stay in this room are like me, then I guess that's what we do. We do these kinds of things. Neuroscientists call parts of this process mirror neurons, which are the systems in our brains that help us imitate, empathize, and learn from one another at the level of perception and even at the level of the subconscious. We are always being formed. There's so much good that comes with this. In fact, we're able to be formed continually over the course of life in wonderful ways. It's why children, especially infants, need smiles. They need smiles because their mirror neurons are starting to automatically begin to fire off, and they are looking for someone who is glad to be in their presence. But we can also influence one another in deeply damaging ways as well, right? This is the classic saying, right? If your friend jumped, like your mom probably said it too, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you do that too? And you're like, yes, if there was a bungee cord. So let me ask you this. What shapes you? What shapes you? What media outlets shape you? What family members shape you? What social media personalities shape you? This idea of individuals carrying influence over one another, we know that this is a reality, which is why there's an entire subgenre of employment known as a social media influencer, right? Because we seek to be influenced and we seek to influence others. Now, there's a biblical term for this as well. It's the term discipleship. We are always being discipled. Now, when you think of that phrase, discipleship, if you've been around the church or any parachurch ministries for very long, you've likely heard that term used in any number of ways. But most often, it is associated with the idea of information transfer. You sit down with one-on-one to one-on-three to a small group, and there is information transfer that happens. Someone who knows more tells the information to someone who knows less. Or you learn together in the Bible or through a study or through a book some type of information. In other words, discipleship in our day and age is largely focused on intellectual knowing. But if that is all biblical discipleship is, then why aren't we Christians who know better doing better? Why are we Christians who know better still struggle to actually live it out? Aristotle actually articulated this. He said that if people just all learned the truth, if you just learned enough, then your actions would be in light of that, because it would be illogical for your actions to not line up with what you know is true. And is that illogical to do what you know is bad? Yes. Do we do what we know is bad? Yes. It's a part of the human condition. Now, John Mark Comer, in his book, he articulates it this way. For those of us who desire to follow Jesus, here is the reality that we must turn and face. If we're not being intentionally formed by Jesus, then it's highly likely that we're being unintentionally formed by someone or something else. So, why might we be informationally, biblically sound, but functionally and formationally, we are more like others who do not know Jesus, but they share the same interests, they belong to the same political parties, they belong to the same socioeconomic class as us? Why are we more like those people than we are like a follower of Jesus in a third world country whose life looks very different than ours? Because it comes down to what influences us, what we allow to inform who am I. Now, many of those influences aren't necessarily evil. Some of them are even good gifts, but good things become dangerous things when they disciple us more deeply than Jesus does. Now, that language of discipleship has been used throughout the last few hundred years in the English language within the church. And oftentimes when language is repeated over and over again, its meaning can get lost over time. So I like how John Mark Comer brings up that its real connection is to apprenticeship. There were terms that were more familiar to Jesus and his followers, and they stemmed from the Jewish rabbinic tradition. They understood discipleship more as apprenticeship or as residency if you're like in the medical field. But when you think of apprenticeship, what kind of comes to your mind? Probably things like if you've ever had a family member, perhaps yourself, went to any of the trades, a plumbing apprentice, an electrician apprentice. Now, what does the apprentice do? The apprentice goes alongside, and they don't just learn the theory from the master. They are learning what to actually do, and they're actually getting their hands dirty. They're doing the thing. They are learning what it looks like to do the thing. But when we think of our discipleship to Jesus, do we really perceive that we are learning to do the thing? Now, in the traditional Jewish education system of Jesus' day, children first attended a school called Bet Sefer, which is the house of the book. This is where they learn to read scripture and often memorize a large portion of the Torah. Are you guys ready to feel shamed? Many by the age of 10 could recite Genesis through Deuteronomy by heart. 10. That's crazy. Okay, now let's keep going with the shame. All right, the best students from that would continue on past that. They would go on to Bet Talmud. This is house of learning. This is where they would study the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. And in some traditions, they would memorize much of the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, while learning how to interpret it and learning how to debate it. So now we're talking about 12-year-olds that are learning how to debate the deep philosophies of Jewish religious thought. That's crazy. Okay, now that's only the best of the best. But the best of the best of the best, they get to go on past that. They go on to what is called Bet Midrash. This is the house of study. This is to become an apprentice to a rabbi. So rabbis were traveling teachers. And when they would come through town, they would look for who were the best of the best. And they would interview and grill you. And if you were the best of the best 14-year-old imaginable, they would say, "Come follow me." And it wasn't come follow me to learn all my information and be able to regurgitate it properly. It's to learn how to engage in the scriptures, to embody them, and to begin to teach them themselves. And the goal was not merely information transfer, but it was transformation into the rabbi's way of life. So when they said, "Come follow me," a disciple wasn't simply saying, I'm going to do a summer internship. I'm going to come out like, when's it convenient for me? They were like, okay, I guess I'm on the road with you for the next few years, and whatever you say goes. And where you go, I go. And they would reorient their entire life around three foundational realities that we're going to actually explore the next 3 weeks: of being with the rabbi, of becoming like the rabbi, and of doing what their rabbi did. Now, when we talk about the disciples of Jesus, the apprentices of Jesus, we don't know how far along they got in the religious education system. What we do know is they didn't get to that last marker. And here's how we know that. Because they had all returned to their family businesses at some point. And so in Matthew chapter 4, Matthew records it this way: while walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. In other words, they were not ready to be called to be a disciple. If that was ever their dream, that ship had sailed long ago. And so he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And then it goes on. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. There was a sequence of essentials to the Jewish faith, but there was also uniqueness of interpretation that each rabbi would hold, and they would pass on those learnings to the next generation. And then your responsibility as disciples to carry on that teaching and to continue to develop it in thinking and in practical life. These teachings, these interpretations were referred to as the yoke of the rabbi. Thinking of a yoke, not in terms of an egg, obviously, but in terms of the wooden piece that would go over a team of oxen. And that yoke would keep them moving in alignment. And so that language was used to describe the teaching, the life practice, the lifestyle of the rabbi. Their yoke was their way toward the good life according to the Torah. Now, there were two major groups that sometimes we can easily lump them together in the biblical story, but they were very different and distinct. And they describe two very different understandings of the yoke. The first was the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they followed a very fundamentalist religious tradition. There was a high focus and value on moral and ritualistic purity. They believed that strict religious rigor was the path to holiness. And honestly, oftentimes we really just shout down the concept of the Pharisees and they're just the villains par excellence. But the reality is, they're the good guys in the story in every version up until this moment. They were the ones who said, no, we need to protect the way of God. We need to do things in a way that honors him. We need to care about the things that matters to him. We need to care about generosity. We need to care about holiness. And they actually believed that the Messiah would return when the nation returned in holiness. They believed strict religious rigor was the path to holiness, but here's the problem. Their yoke was crushing people. This is what Jesus would say in Matthew 23, verse 4, talking about the Pharisees. They tie up heavy burdens. So again, listen to the language of yoke. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. So that's the Pharisees. On the other end of the rabbinic political spectrum were the Sadducees. Now, their yoke was more accommodating to changing times. The Sadducees were super aristocratic. They were priestly. They were politically aligned with Rome. And they were kind of like, do whatever it takes to kind of get along under this oppressive regime. And so their yoke emphasized things like the temple systems, political stability, sacrificial religion, institutional power, preserving power and authority and order. Now, again, we often lump those two together. So we talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't like Jesus, but they also really didn't like each other. They had major beef. And so they were constantly turned against one another until there was a common enemy for them to both turn toward. So along comes Jesus, this rabbi who lived in neither of those camps. Instead, he explained his yoke this way. Matthew 11, this was our passage earlier. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. At my very core, my essence is gentle and lowly, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Do you believe that to be true about the way of Jesus? Like, really? You might intellectually agree that is what Jesus said, and you're like, I believe him, I trust him. But do you experience that as your reality? See, Jesus doesn't say first, perform for me. What does he say first? Come to me. Apprenticeship to Jesus was never meant to be about striving, but about surrendering. Jesus offers a yoke that is not burdensome, not backbreaking, and it refuses to sell out. It's a yoke that images what Moses had proclaimed years before when he proclaimed a message over the nation of Israel. And he said in Deuteronomy 5, "You shall walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you shall possess." What's Moses getting at? The people of Israel had been consistent in their inconsistency for 40 years of desert wandering. And now they are standing on the precipice of entering into the land of promise. And Moses is concerned for them. And what he says is, live the path of life. Do things God's way. I promise what you're going to discover is his way isn't just an arbitrarily better way. It is an actually lived in, felt experience, better way towards life. And Jesus would take this language that he uses here, that you may walk in the way, and he says, I am the way. I am the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. See, Israel had existed as kind of a microcosm of humanity, demonstrating unreal potential, but also this continuous unwillingness to follow into the way of God, to view God as their king, and to live according to his way. And so here comes along Rabbi Jesus, and he is proclaiming, I am the way. I am the ultimate guide. I am God in the flesh, coming to lead the true and better people into the true and better land of promise. Inviting you and me into his presence. He says, take on my yoke. Be holistically formed so that you can do what I am up to. Live as one of my apprentices and discover life with me, which is what he was getting at in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, when he proclaims, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. As we are being discipled, we will be like our teacher. Let me ask you this, who is your teacher? On first answer, I'd hope for you would say Jesus. But let me ask again, who actually is your teacher? Not who do you want to be your teacher, not who should be your teacher, but whose classroom do you sit in on a daily basis? Which rabbi do you tend to follow around? See, we're all becoming someone, and we're all being formed by someone. The question is not whether we are being formed. The question is who or what is forming you into their image. Are you being formed by a talking voice on a screen more than the voice of God in the scriptures? There's a classic rabbinic blessing back in the day. It was this: may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. Now that sounds kind of weird, but when you think about it, in a world without any paved roads, you would be sure to be covered in dust as you walked with someone else. And so I think of Pigpen from Peanuts, right? Like look at Snoopy. He's not stoked to be in that dust of that rabbi. But anyone who is close to Pigpen, whenever you watch any of the Peanuts cartoons, is guaranteed to be covered in a dust cloud by proximity. And so to follow in the dust of your rabbi is to spend time in such regular proximity to him that the evidence remains. John Mark Comer explains it this way: apprentices of Jesus become people who increasingly live and love like Jesus in the world. Apprentices of Jesus become people who are increasingly live and love like Jesus in the world. I was born in the very early 90s, and so I was old enough to remember the What Would Jesus Do bracelets. And then I remember a little bit of time later, we all stopped calling ourselves Christians nearly as often and started referring to ourselves more often as Christ followers, or like we'd say, like, I'm a follower of Jesus. But is it true? Are we orienting our lives daily around him? This Jesus movement has been known by many different things, many different ways, and many different times. At the very beginning, they were known as the followers of the way, because there was the way of Jesus, and we followed him on that path. The irony of the reason we stopped using the word Christian is because it lost its meaning. But where that word comes from in Greek was from the town of Antioch. In Antioch, there was this thriving multicultural, multi-ethnic Jesus movement that was happening there. And there, it's recorded in Acts that they began to be called Christianos, or Christians, or little Christs. That when you see Christians walking around, it's like a bunch of little mini-me's of Jesus walking around everywhere. Like, oh, they're just doing all the Jesus stuff. But Bill Maher, who is a crude, rude comedian, atheist, he said, I wish that they would call themselves Christ-like so they could remember who they're trying to be like. It's like shots fired. That is meant to be us. And whatever phrase, whatever descriptors we use to talk about ourselves, the paradigm remains. Whether we are followers of the way or the ones who wear "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets, we are meant to be those whose lives are being transformed by the presence and proximity of Jesus. That the way, the truth, and the life of Jesus would become the way and truth of life of each and every one of us. And as we are with him, as we are becoming like him, we do what he would be doing if he were us. In other words, we practice the way. Now, we don't introduce the language of practicing the way so that we have a new catchphrase that we would regurgitate without actually following through. But just as we would if we were learning any new skill, or if you were taking on any new hobby, what would you begin to do? Hopefully, you would not just try to learn a bunch about the hobby. You would begin to practice the hobby. You would begin to train, which is how Paul and the others disciple would describe this thing that we could refer to as the normal Christian life, a life of training up in righteousness. I like how the French actually translate their version of the word train. In French, it is formation. It's formation. Training is formational. We are being formed, sculpted, shaped. Now, the language of spiritual formation, it's a Christian buzzword right now and over the last 10 years, and some people love that language, some people hate it. But either way, what matters at the core is this, that your spiritual life is being formed. Will it be formed more and more to the image of Jesus? Not just on surface level actions or informational understanding. Do you strive to be intellectually formed by Jesus or holistically formed by Jesus? It's not that there isn't more to know about him or about his way. It's just that it's more than just that. Throughout the ages, followers of the way have found ancient practices, most of which began with rabbinic Hebrew practices, to be helpful in positioning us in proximity to our rabbi. Eventually, that language would be adopted into a rule. A rule is when we think of rules, we think of like do's and don'ts. We might think of scissors, things that cut us back and tell us what we can and can't do. But in Latin, the word rule or reglas is more like a trellis, which you're surrounded by trellises. That's kind of cool. So there's all these trellises around. And what do trellises do? They give structure and guidance so that life can thrive. Any vine fruit that does not have a trellis or anything else to graft onto, it will kill in on itself and die. We are meant to be like vines, like branches hanging onto the vine. And when we have the right structures to hold on to, it allows life to thrive. So in the early centuries of the Jesus movement, they began referring to two different things, the rule of faith and the rule of life. The rule of faith is right belief. So these were the early doctrine statements of the church. These were creeds and things like that that you would repeat in your baptism and throughout your life so you'd remember what is true about God and his people. But then you also had a rule of life, which is all about the way of actually doing life like Jesus. They were holistic, spiritual disciplines or rhythms meant to position us as followers of Jesus in the dust cloud of our rabbi. They're not just practices so that you could be viewed as a good Christian. They don't earn you anything with God. They create a margin for encounter. And so this, on Practicing the Ways website, if you're interested in any of this, they have so many great resources. It's all free. This is actually a picture of my rule of life. I know it's super hard to read from there. And if you get closer, it's blurry, so it's really good. But I want to give you just an example of kind of how it looks like. There's different spiritual disciplines, different spiritual rhythms to engage in, and they can kind of give you encouragement on what that would actually look like for you and for your families. And so I found this really helpful. Now, I imagine you've been introduced to at least a few spiritual disciplines throughout the course of your life, but there are two main categories. One is practices of abstinence. And so practices of abstinence are ones of abstaining from particular things, where we refrain for a period of time from something, not to somehow become the martyr, but to create space for God and to expose unhealthy attachments. And so these are practices like fasting and silence, solitude, secrecy, simplicity, and one that our culture needs desperately, Sabbath. The goal, again, is not deprivation for deprivation's sake. It's not to stop doing things so that you can just be more, so you can be viewed as more holy, but freedom and surrender. And so the others are practices of engagement. And so some examples of that are confession, service, generosity, celebration, meditation, and engaging scripture, prayer, worship, community, and witness. Each of these are all about creating relational connection and formation into the way of Jesus. Practicing the Ways website, again, is incredibly helpful, free resource, and even has these spiritual reflections for you to do the same reflection every couple months so you can just see, where am I? Where am I struggling right now? What's been going on in my heart and in my mind? Not so that we do a bunch of navel gazing, but that as we are with Jesus, that we are learning to surrender more and more fully to him. So who are you following? Who holds influence on your life, your worldview, your schedule? In a moment, we're going to simply create space here and now to just reflect on, where have I been with Jesus? I like how John Wesley, founder of the Methodist movement, once articulated it this way. This is a question he would regularly ask people. How is it with your soul? So I want you to just spend time with Jesus, asking him that. How is it with my soul? Is there any wayward part in me? Would you expose that and bring that to reality? Would you confess the areas of your life where someone or something seems to hold greater sway than Jesus? See, Jesus' great desire for you and for me is to experience life in his presence, to be transformed in proximity to him, and to begin to live as one who is loved by him. See, the invitation of Jesus is not merely believe the right things about me. It is walk with me. Know me really. To be close enough to gather his dust, to be close enough that over time people begin to notice that in this community at King's Cross, this is a people who sound like Jesus, who love like Jesus, who forgive like Jesus, who live like Jesus. We're going to take a few minutes to just be in the presence of God. May you be so covered in the dust of a rabbi that the world cannot help but see Jesus on us. Let's pray.